Today, the United States Senate decided to effectively end the lifespan of the penny, debated whether to hand over, massive global trade powers to the president, and, well, they barely managed to avoid shutting down the entire federal government.
Yeah, and I mean, they did all of that before most people even clocked out for dinner. It really was an extraordinary showcase of the just the sheer scope of congressional responsibility.
It's wild. You're watching lawmakers pivot from macro-level geopolitics straight to, like, the literal physical coins sitting in your pocket.
Exactly. In a
Yeah.
single afternoon.
Well, welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today's Deep Dive is a special focus we're calling Congress in Context. We are taking a comprehensive look at the legislative actions from a really active Senate session on August 7, 2026.
Right, and we're going to unpack how all these policies actually impact your daily life.
Yeah. But before we jump into that, just a really quick housekeeping note. This deep dive is a completely independent project. So if you want to support the production infrastructure, help keep this ad-free civic education resource sustainable, you can use the Buy Me a Coffee link right in your app's show notes.
And you'll also find a full bill summary breakdown at that exact same link, which is super helpful if you want to read the source material yourself.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start with the foundational requirement of any government, which is just keeping the lights on.
Yeah, right. Because before Congress can debate new laws about international trade or election procedures, they have to ensure federal agencies are actually funded to execute those laws.
Right. Without funding, the whole operational capacity of the executive branch just effectively pauses.
Exactly. And that brings us to legislative action on H.R. 6500, which is the Continuing Appropriations and Extensions Act.
Right. And the Senate passed H.R. 6500 with a vote of 90-6. And there was one senator voting present.
Yeah. In simple terms, this stopgap measure averted a government shutdown for fiscal year 2027. It maintains the current funding framework, so federal agencies can continue operating while the permanent long-term bills are still being negotiated in committee.
Because, the appropriations process is supposed to result in 12 distinct detailed spending bills, right, passed before the end of the fiscal year.
That's the ideal structure, yeah.
Yeah.
But when Congress cannot reach an agreement on those detailed bills in time, they use a continuing resolution.
Which I always think of a continuing resolution, or a CR, as essentially a bridge loan for the government.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, like, you aren't buying a new house, you're just scraping together enough cash to maintain the status quo and keep the lights on until your actual permanent paycheck clears.
Right, exactly. It freezes the current spending levels right in place. But the political interest rate on that loan is kind of high because it forces agencies to operate on last year's budget priorities rather than, adapting to new challenges.
Yeah. Although lawmakers do occasionally attach very specific, targeted administrative directives to these stopgap bills, right?
They do, yeah. For example, Senator Susan Collins included a distinct provision in this one, in H.R. 6500, regarding the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB.
Okay, what did that do?
Well, this bill successfully prevented a proposed OMB administrative rule regarding federal financial assistance from actually taking effect.
Okay, let's unpack the real-world impact of that. Like, what would that OMB rule have done, and why did Senator Collins prioritize halting it?
So the OMB sets the overarching guidelines for how federal grant money is distributed across the entire country. And Senator Collins argued the proposed rule had the potential to politicize that grant-making procedure.
Politicize it how?
Specifically, she noted it would alter the baseline criteria for how federal funds are distributed to rural communities, as well as to, university nonprofit research laboratories.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. So by blocking the rule in this continuing resolution, the Senate maintained the existing grant distribution formulas. That ensured the financial criteria remained unchanged and, predictable for those rural and research entities.
That makes total sense. A tiny tweak in a formula in Washington can mean millions of dollars either flowing to or being diverted from a rural hospital or a local university.
Exactly. It's a huge mechanical shift masked as a minor administrative rule.
Yeah. Okay, so with the macro-level budget secured, the Senate immediately shifted its focus to the micro level of the economy. And when I say micro, I mean literally the smallest denomination of physical currency in the country.
Right. This brings us to a really fascinating piece of economic legislation, S-1525, known as the Common Sense Act.
Which, aside from being a very solid legislative pun, actually changes how we interact with money on a daily basis.
It does. The bill dictates that the Treasury must stop minting the 1-cent coin within a year of the bill's enactment.
Okay, so no more pennies at all.
None. Because the penny will no longer be introduced into circulation, the bill requires a procedural change to cash transactions. Moving forward, cash totals will be rounded to the nearest 5 cents.
Okay, let's trace exactly how that works at the cash register because, people get very protective of their money. How does the math work?
Mathematically, if a transaction total ends in 1, 2, 3, or 4 cents, it rounds down. So a total of $1.11 and $1.12 just rounds down to $1.10.
Okay.
But if it ends in 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 cents, it rounds up. So a total of $1.13 or $1.14 would round up to $1.15.
Got it. And the core policy rationale here is just production cost, right?
Yeah, exactly. For years, the cost of the zinc and copper required to mint a penny has just exceeded the face value of the coin itself. The government effectively loses money on every penny it produces.
But wait, I want to push back on the impact of that rounding rule specifically regarding the consumer. If you're rounding up and down, does that statistically balance out over time for cash-reliant populations? Or does a system like this inherently benefit retailers by sort of nudging average transaction costs upward?
That's a really valid point.
Because we know that unbanked populations rely much more heavily on physical cash, so there is a real risk of a regressive impact here.
Yeah, and that is an incredibly important question regarding the distributional impact. Lawmakers debated that exact point. And to address it, the bill provides a specific exemption.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The rounding requirement applies exclusively to physical cash transactions. Electronic payments, credit cards, debit cards, and checks are entirely exempt.
Oh, I see.
Right. So if you pay with a card, your $1.13 charge remains exactly $1.13.
Okay, so it confines the friction strictly to the physical realm. That is a crucial distinction.
Absolutely.
Now, while the Senate was looking at how everyday people spend their cash, they also spent time debating how the government reports its own spending.
Yes. That is H.R. 2069, the Stop Secret Spending Act. This bill requires federal agencies to report what are called other transaction agreements directly to USAspending.gov.
Okay, let's translate that out of Washington jargon for a second. What makes an other transaction agreement or an OTA different from just a standard government contract?
Well, standard federal contracts involve a really rigid, multi-layered procurement process. They can take months or even years to finalize just to ensure competitive bidding and regulatory compliance.
Right, lots of red tape.
Exactly. But other transaction agreements bypass some of those traditional regulations. They are flexible procurement tools designed for speed. They're most frequently utilized by agencies like the Department of Defense or Health and Human Services for rapid research and development projects.
So, to put an analogy on it, a standard contract is like going through a corporate purchasing department where you need 3 quotes, a manager's signature, and a 30-day review. But an OTA is like handing an agency a corporate credit card and saying, we need this prototype built by next week. Just get it done. It is way faster, but the oversight is vastly different.
That is exactly it. And because OTAs bypass those standard reporting frameworks, they are much harder to track.
Right.
So HR 2069 establishes clear data standards so that these specific flexible agreements are captured and published on usaspending.gov. It basically establishes a clear requirement for public accountability and transparency in that specific category of federal spending.
Okay, so we go from tracking individual pennies at the grocery store to tracking rapid response federal procurement data online. But then from domestic spending, the Senate immediately pivoted to international economics. And this is where the debate became incredibly intense.
It really did.
Because they moved to authorize hundreds of billions of dollars in international trade tariffs.
Right. We are looking at H.R. 5334, the Lindsey O Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act. Ultimately, the bill passed with a vote of 86 to 11. It utilizes economic policy as a direct tool for national security.
The overwhelming final vote count is a bit deceptive, though, right? Because it kind of masks a very fierce debate on the floor over the separation of powers.
You're completely right to point that out. The most significant debate centered on an amendment proposed by Senators Rand Paul and Ron Wyden.
Which was amendment number 6715, I believe?
Yes. It was rejected by a vote of 32 to 64, but the arguments presented illustrate a really deep historical divide over executive authority.
Okay, let's break down those arguments. Why did Senator Paul and Senator Wyden oppose the underlying bill's tariff framework?
Their opposition focused heavily on the transfer of power. They argue that the legislation grants the executive branch unchecked authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on foreign nations.
Wow, up to 100%.
Yeah. And Senator Paul stated this acts as an unconstitutional delegation of congressional taxing authority.
Right, because Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to levy taxes.
Exactly. And because tariffs are paid by the domestic importing businesses and ultimately passed on to American buyers, Senator Paul argued that granting this tariff authority functionally allows the president to enact a $500 billion tax increase on American consumers, completely without specific congressional approval.
Right. That is the core economic reality of a tariff that people often miss. The foreign country doesn't just write a check to the U.S. Treasury. The American business importing the goods pays the fee.
Yes.
And Senator Wyden had a process concern as well, didn't he?
She did. Senator Wyden highlighted the lack of a congressional rollback procedure.
What does that mean mechanically?
Well, his argument was that if the executive branch applies these tariffs aggressively, perhaps even targeting allied nations based on a broad interpretation of the law, Congress has no streamlined built-in legislative mechanism to reverse that decision.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they would have to pass entirely new legislation to stop it.
That raises a massive question. How do lawmakers balance the risk of domestic inflation, which, broad tariffs can definitely trigger against these international security objectives?
That was the core of the counterargument made by proponents, which included Senators Todd Young, Jeanne Shaheen, and Richard Blumenthal.
Okay, what was their position?
They argued that the broad tariff authority is a necessary structural requirement to achieve a specific geopolitical goal, which is imposing real, unavoidable economic costs on countries that purchase Russian-origin crude oil.
So the tool they are using is essentially a secondary sanction.
Right.
You aren't just sanctioning Russia directly, you're heavily taxing any third party that does business with Russia, which effectively chokes off the financing of the war in Ukraine.
Precisely. Because in modern global finance, bad actors use incredibly complex networks to evade direct sanctions. Proponents argued the executive branch needs the speed and flexibility of this broad tariff authority to immediately penalize those secondary networks. They can't wait months for Congress to pass a new, specific law for every offending country.
Right. And to address the concerns about the president having too much unchecked power, there was actually a very specific bipartisan action taken during the debate, right?
Yes. Senator Raphael Warnock submitted a letter to the congressional record from U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Jamieson Greer, and this provided a formal administrative guardrail.
But wait, how does a letter submitted to the record actually restrict the president?
Well, by placing it on the formal legislative record, it establishes the documented legislative intent of the bill.
Okay.
The letter clarified that the executive branch only has the legal basis to apply these tariffs to countries that explicitly meet the criteria defined in the legislation.
I see.
It formally binds the president's authority, ensuring the tariffs can only be deployed against entities actively facilitating the sanctioned behavior, rather than just being used as a broad discretionary weapon in, unrelated trade disputes.
Oh, that makes sense. It's a really great example of how Congress establishes boundaries.
It is.
And speaking of boundaries, passing complex international sanctions and domestic spending laws requires a functioning executive branch to actually enforce them.
Right.
Which brings us to the most narrowly divided vote of the entire August 7th session, confirming the nation's top law enforcement officer.
Yes. The Senate voted to confirm Todd Blanche to serve as Attorney General of the United States.
And when we say narrowly divided, we mean it. The vote count was 50 to 49.
A razor-thin margin.
Literally as close as it gets.
To understand how this tight vote was resolved, we really have to look at the floor speech delivered by Senator Bill Cassidy, who served as a decisive vote in this confirmation.
Yeah, I was looking at Cassidy's floor speech, and it surprised me because he actively criticized Blanche's past actions. How does he justify flipping to a yes vote?
Well, Senator Cassidy was very transparent about his evaluation process and his reservations. He acknowledged significant structural concerns regarding Blanche's past record.
What kind of concerns?
Specifically, he cited Blanche's previous approval of an anti-weaponization fund and his involvement in establishing exemptions for IRS audits. Cassidy noted these raised administrative red flags regarding the equal application of the law.
Okay, so with those fairly serious reservations, why give him the job?
His vote was ultimately based on operational needs and legislative leverage. Cassidy detailed conversations he held with two local U.S. attorneys from his home state of Louisiana, David Corsell and Kurt Wall.
So getting perspective from the federal prosecutors actually on the ground rather than just the politicians in Washington.
Exactly. And those U.S. attorneys reported that under Blanche's temporary leadership as the acting head of the DOJ, the department had implemented highly effective accountability measures.
Like what?
They stated that Blanche provided the necessary resources to prosecute violent crime, disrupt human trafficking networks, and crucially, recover nearly $1 billion in healthcare fraud.
Wow. Okay. And here is where the confirmation process itself becomes the real story, I think.
Right.
An acting cabinet secretary is appointed by the president and can operate with a degree of independence from Congress. But a confirmed cabinet secretary has to answer to Senate committees.
Yes, that's the mechanical reality.
Cassidy essentially argued that officially confirming Blanche binds him to the Senate. The legislative branch retains vastly more structural oversight capability over the Department of Justice through subpoenas and mandatory hearings if they confirm him, rather than if they reject him and the president simply leaves an unconfirmed acting attorney general in place indefinitely.
That is a critical process insight. The confirmation power is not just about approving a nominee. It's about establishing a formal, legally binding relationship between the executive branch appointee and the legislative branch committee framework.
Right. So in one session, they funded the government, debated the penny, authorized global tariffs, and confirmed the attorney general.
A busy day.
Very. But the session didn't end there. They briefly turned their attention to the foundational procedures of the government itself, which is election law.
This brings us to the unfinished business of the session, S-5271.
Okay, what was this bill?
This bill was designed to amend the Help America Vote Act of 2002. It would create a federal administrative requirement for voters to provide valid photo identification in order to cast an in-person ballot.
And what was the specific legislative action on this?
The Senate held a vote on a motion to invoke cloture.
Okay, let's clarify cloture for those listening, because it is basically the defining rule of the modern Senate. The Senate requires a 60-vote supermajority to end debate on most legislation and move to a final up or down vote.
Right.
That is cloture. If you don't get 60 votes, the bill essentially stalls out on the floor. It's what most people refer to as a filibuster.
That's exactly correct. And in this case, the motion to invoke cloture failed by a vote of 52 to 46.
So, because it fell short of the 60-vote threshold, the bill did not advance.
Correct.
Even though it didn't pass, the stated positions on the floor give us a very clear map of the partisan divide on election procedure, don't they?
They do. The stated positions on the floor were starkly divided. Proponents of S-5271 argued that the legislation is necessary to establish standardized, nationwide identification procedures.
Right.
Their argument focused on guaranteeing election security and uniform application of voting requirements across all 50 states.
When the opposition, what was their stated stance?
Opponents, who were represented on the floor by Senator Alex Padilla, argued against the prioritization of the bill.
Okay.
Senator Padilla argued that the focus of the Senate should remain strictly on advancing bills that address the immediate economic costs facing working families, rather than altering the administrative requirements for federal elections.
Gotcha.
And because the cloture motion failed, this ensures that the debate over federal election requirements will just remain a pending, unresolved legislative battle for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and that perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of Congress. I mean, they pass sweeping international sanctions in 1 hour, and then completely gridlock on domestic election procedure the next.
It is a vast administrative apparatus. And honestly, watching how they prioritize and process these issues provides a very clear window into the current state of national policy.
It really does. Well, we want to express our deep gratitude to you, the listener, for taking this deep dive with us today. As a reminder, this show is a completely independent civic education resource.
Yeah.
So if you found this breakdown valuable and want to help keep it ad-free and sustainable, please consider using the Buy Me a Coffee link right there in your episode description.
And if you want to verify or explore any of the legislation we discussed today, whether it's the Common Sense Act or the exact text of the Russia sanctions bill, you can find and read the full text of all these bills by visiting congress.gov.
Highly recommend checking that out.
It's a great resource. I also highly encourage you to contact your local representatives to voice your opinions on how these specific policies impact your daily life.
Yeah.
Tracking committee hearings online is a highly effective way to actively participate in democracy far beyond just casting a ballot on Election Day.
Absolutely. The government is always working, and you have the right to watch exactly how those decisions are made.
Exactly.
As we close out, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Throughout this specific session, we watched Congress willingly hand massive, multi-billion-dollar economic tariff powers over to the executive branch in the name of national security and rapid response.
Right.
But practically in the same breath, they fought tooth and nail during the Attorney General confirmation to maintain strict legislative oversight over that very same executive branch's Department of Justice.
This fascinating contrast.
It is. So as you look at the mechanics of modern government, consider this. In an era that increasingly requires rapid global responses, is the slow, deliberate legislative process designed by the founders being permanently outsourced to the faster-acting executive branch. And if that is the case, what does that mean for the balance of power moving forward? Keep an eye on Washington. We will see you next time.